Have you ever sat at a family table, realizing your own blood considers you less than dust because you refuse to brag? That was my reality on Christmas Eve. When my arrogant brother raised his glass to humiliate me, he had no idea my silence was actually a sworn national security oath. Grab a strong coffee. You are about to hear how a so-called nobody lit a match and burned a fake empire to the ground. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Maya Revenge Stories channel. Because YouTube recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us with zero budget, I sincerely ask that if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 via the PayPal QR code on your screen or the link in the description, so we can pay our staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness. And now let us begin. My name is Maria Lane, and I am 34 years old. The air inside our family estate in Aspen, Colorado, was suffocating, heavy with the scent of expensive pine and even more expensive hypocrisy. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a perfect white blizzard was burying the Rocky Mountains. But inside the dining room, the temperature felt completely frozen for an entirely different reason. We were gathered around a massive mahogany dining table for the annual Lane family Christmas dinner. It was never a warm family gathering, but rather a flashy, over-the-top spectacle designed purely for my relatives to stroke their own egos and compare their bank accounts. I sat near the very end of the table, feeling entirely out of place in my simple dark dress, drowning in a sea of designer gowns, custom-tailored suits, and forced laughter. At the head of the table sat my older brother, Julian. He was the undisputed golden child, a supposed tech genius whose face was plastered across the covers of glossy business magazines every single month. He leaned back in his velvet chair, casually swirling vintage champagne in his crystal flute. He tapped his silver fork against the delicate glass to demand silence from the room. The sycophants at the table obeyed instantly, turning their attention to their favorite billionaire. "To another record-breaking year for the Lane legacy," Julian began, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. He took a sip, then locked his eyes directly on me, his smirk sharpening into something incredibly cruel. "And to those who merely ride our coattails, tell me, Maria, how is that measly desk job of yours going? Are you still pushing useless papers for a tiny government salary while the rest of us actually build the future? It really is an absolute shame to see a nobody loser wasting our family name." A chorus of polite, mocking laughter rippled across the table. Aunts and uncles hid their cruel smiles behind their linen napkins. I looked toward my father, hoping for a single shred of decency or defense, but he simply nodded in firm agreement with Julian. My father took a slow sip of his expensive scotch, setting the glass down with a heavy sigh of theatrical disappointment. "Your brother has a very valid point, Maria," my father said, his tone laced with a heavy, judgmental edge. "You bring absolutely zero value to this family. You have no prestige, no media presence, and no equity. Look at what Julian has built with his own two hands. He has a technological empire, and you are a ghost. You give nothing to the Lane legacy, and quite frankly, it is embarrassing to explain to my friends what my daughter does for a living." I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at them and kept my face as calm and cold as the winter storm raging outside. They truly thought I was a failure because my name was not trending on social media. They thought my quiet life was a clear symptom of mediocrity and weakness. I was completely used to keeping a cool head under immense pressure because my so-called measly desk job was actually a meticulously crafted cover. For the past 8 years, I had been operating deep inside the Vanguard Echo Directorate, a top-secret cybersecurity intelligence agency so classified it did not exist on any public government budget or official document. I hunted down international cyber syndicates and dismantled digital threats to national security on a daily basis. Sitting through the petty insults of my shallow family was child's play, compared to interrogating state-sponsored hackers in an undisclosed location. Julian, entirely mistaking my silence for submission, leaned forward across the table, ready to deliver his final blow. He placed his glass down with a sharp thud that echoed in the dining room. "Honestly, Dad," Julian sneered, his eyes filled with malicious glee, "it is time we have a serious talk about the family trust fund. There is absolutely no reason to keep dead weight on the payroll. I think it is time we cut the nobody out of the will entirely before she drains what I have worked so hard to build." He opened his mouth to hurl yet another insult about my supposed worthlessness, but he never got the chance. A sharp, rhythmic thumping suddenly echoed from the grand hallway. The heavy, deliberate strike of solid wood against the marble floor cut through the tense silence of the dining room like a knife. Everyone froze in their seats. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the imposing figure of my grandfather stepped out of the shadows and into the bright light of the chandelier. Arthur Lane was a retired four-star general and the legendary commander who had built the very first cyber warfare division for the United States military from the ground up. Even in his late 80s, he possessed an aura of absolute, terrifying authority that could make grown men tremble in fear. He stood tall, leaning slightly on his polished wooden cane, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. My grandfather slowly scanned the luxurious room, his eyes sharp as razors, before locking his deadly gaze directly onto Julian's pale, arrogant face. The entire room held its breath, the silence suddenly deafening. Julian nervously opened his mouth to greet him, but the general slammed his cane against the marble floor to silence him instantly. "This nobody," my grandfather declared, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the crystal glasses on the dining table, "is the only person in this house who will not be wearing a prison uniform before the new year." I left the suffocating air of Aspen behind before the clock even struck midnight, while the rest of my relatives were likely still hyperventilating over my grandfather's ominous declaration. I was already navigating through the blizzard toward the local airfield. I boarded a red-eye military transport flight heading straight to Virginia. By 6 in the morning, I was stepping out of the freezing wind and descending 50 feet below ground into the heavily fortified subterranean headquarters of the Vanguard Echo Directorate. The air down here was clinical, smelling of ozone and black coffee, a stark contrast to the cloying perfume of my family's dinner party. I walked straight past the security checkpoints, my badge granting me access to the deepest restricted levels. Sitting down at my secure workstation, surrounded by glowing monitors in a dimly lit server room, I pulled up a highly classified, heavily encrypted data packet. It had pinged my private network exactly 2 hours before I arrived at the Aspen estate. The sender was completely masked, bouncing through dozens of proxy servers across the globe, but the encryption key was a very specific sequence of military coordinates. It was a cipher only one person knew: my grandfather. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Running the decryption sequence, a progress bar crawled across my screen. Finally hitting 100%, the files unpacked, and the undeniable truth of Julian's so-called genius spilled out in front of me in lines of raw data, legal documents, and financial ledgers. The first folder contained the core architecture of the artificial intelligence software that Julian had supposedly invented, the very product that made him a Silicon Valley darling. But looking at the source code, my blood ran cold. It was not his, not a single line of it. The fundamental algorithms were carbon copies of classified military patents filed over 30 years ago. The sole owner of those patents was General Arthur Lane. Julian was not a prodigy. He was a common thief playing dress-up with his grandfather's intellectual property. But the theft was only the tip of the iceberg. I opened the financial records. According to the business magazines, Julian's company was valued at over $2 billion. The reality, hidden behind layers of creative accounting, was catastrophic. Julian was drowning in debt. His company was burning through cash at an alarming rate, losing nearly $5 million every single month. He was weeks away from complete bankruptcy and public ruin. My heart pounded against my ribs as I dug deeper into the shadow ledgers. If he was bleeding that much money, how was he keeping the servers running? The answer was hidden in the third folder, and it made me feel physically sick. To save his dying empire, Julian had been secretly accepting massive capital injections from a web of obscure shell companies. Using the Vanguard database, I traced the routing numbers and corporate registries. The trail bypassed traditional banks entirely, winding through overseas tax havens before finally stopping at state-run intelligence fronts. They were hostile foreign organizations. Julian was not just taking their dirty money. In exchange for millions of dollars in untraceable funding, my arrogant brother was quietly selling them backdoor access to the core algorithms. He was handing over the keys to software that was actively being integrated into American municipal grids and private defense contractors. He was committing high treason just to keep his face on the cover of magazines. I kept digging, frantically searching the money trail to see how Julian was washing the foreign funds to make them look like legitimate revenue. The money was being funneled through a complex network of domestic real estate trust funds. I pulled up the registration documents for those trusts, expecting to find the names of shady corporate fixers. Instead, staring back at me on the digital screen, signed in black ink, was my own father's signature. My father, the man who had just sat at the dinner table and called me a worthless nobody, was acting as Julian's personal money launderer. He was using our family's legacy properties to clean the cash of hostile nations. 48 hours later, heavy rain was beating against the greasy windows of an isolated, run-down diner on the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia. The place was empty, save for a tired waitress dozing behind the counter. I sat in a booth at the very back, staring at a lukewarm mug of black coffee. The bell above the door jingled, and my grandfather walked in. He wore a plain trench coat, shedding the aura of the four-star general and looking just like an old man seeking shelter from the storm. He slid into the vinyl booth across from me. He did not ask if I had read the files. He already knew. We sat in heavy silence for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of the rain. "Your brother is a fool," my grandfather finally said, his voice raspy and exhausted. "And your father is worse. I suspected they were mismanaging the assets. But when my old contacts at the Pentagon flagged those algorithm anomalies, I knew it had gone far beyond simple greed." He reached into his pocket and slid a plain black flash drive across the sticky Formica table. It stopped right next to my coffee mug. "I am an old man, Maria," he continued, looking me dead in the eyes. "This is not my battlefield anymore. It is yours. You have the access, the training, and the authority. I am giving you full tactical control. You have two choices. You can wipe those servers clean, let the company collapse quietly, and watch your family go bankrupt in silence." He paused, his jaw tightening into that familiar, unyielding line. "Or," he said softly, "you can burn it all down to the ground. You can expose every single one of them and protect the national security of this country, even if it means destroying the Lane name forever. The choice is yours." I officially submitted a request for a 90-day administrative leave from my directorate. I packed 2 canvas duffel bags and drove straight to my grandfather's sprawling estate in rural Maryland, to my parents, my brother, and the rest of the extended family. My sudden relocation was perfectly in character. They assumed I was just the dutiful, unaccomplished daughter playing the role of a free nursemaid for a rapidly aging, frail old man. It was the perfect cover story. They had no idea that beneath the polished hardwood floors of the historic home, down in the reinforced concrete basement, a very different reality was taking shape. Over the course of 72 hours, I supervised the covert delivery of heavily encrypted servers, secure fiber optic communication lines, and multiple high-resolution tactical monitors. We stripped out the dusty racks of the old wine cellar and transformed the space into a miniature tactical command center that rivaled any forward operating base I had ever managed in Virginia. The humming of the cooling fans became the steady heartbeat of our operation. My grandfather knew that digital warfare was only one half of the battlefield. To completely dismantle Julian, we needed a weapon of mass legal destruction. Arthur made a single, encrypted phone call on a burner device. 2 days later, Evelyn Hayes walked through our basement door. Evelyn was a 65-year-old former military prosecutor who was practically a legend in the Judge Advocate General Corps. She was notorious for destroying corrupt defense contractors and eating corporate attorneys for breakfast. She did not wear designer suits. She wore sharp blazers and an expression of permanent, terrifying focus. Sitting around the makeshift briefing table, Evelyn began drafting a legal noose. Her strategy was not just about suing Julian for patent infringement, it was about constructing a watertight, closed-loop legal perimeter designed to suffocate his company from every possible state and federal jurisdiction simultaneously. While Evelyn built the legal trap, I ran continuous surveillance on the family's communication networks. On the fifth night, a terrifying ping triggered my early warning system. Julian and my father were moving much faster and far dirtier than we had initially anticipated. I intercepted a heavily redacted email sent to their private counsel. They were secretly filing a sealed petition with a local county judge. Their claim was utterly sickening. They were arguing that General Arthur Lane was suffering from severe age-related cognitive decline and dementia. They wanted the court to declare him legally incompetent. It was a desperate, filthy maneuver to strip him of his legal autonomy so they could forcefully seize total control of his intellectual property and his remaining financial assets before the company collapsed. They were trying to bury him alive. Exactly 1 week later, the heavy crunch of gravel announced the arrival of my father. His sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up to the front porch. He walked through the front door smelling of expensive imported cologne and an overwhelming sense of unearned arrogance. I was standing in the kitchen, calmly pouring a cup of hot tea. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if my grandfather was awake or resting. He simply dropped a thick, stapled stack of legal documents onto the marble kitchen island. "Sign these, Maria," my father commanded, using that familiar, condescending tone he always reserved for me. "It is a standard waiver relinquishing your claim to the primary family estate and the secondary trusts. Julian and I are restructuring the asset portfolios to better protect the family legacy, and we cannot have unnecessary complications tying up the capital." He offered a fake, patronizing smile. "Do not worry. We are not throwing you out on the street. I have arranged a small allowance for you, $3,000 a month. It should be more than enough for someone with your limited lifestyle to live day to day." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or throw the papers back in his face. Instead, I quietly reached into the pocket of my wool cardigan and pressed the tactile record button on my concealed digital audio device. I needed him to dig his own grave, and his massive ego was the perfect shovel. "I do not understand," I said, keeping my voice small, timid, and perfectly naive. "Why do I need to sign this right now? Are you and Julian having money problems? Is that why you moved Grandpa's emergency funds out of the primary trust account last month? I saw the bank statements in the mail." My father, entirely blinded by his own arrogance and completely convinced he was talking to a simple-minded desk clerk, swallowed the bait whole. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Money problems. Please, Julian is building a global enterprise, but your grandfather is losing his mind. He is too senile to understand modern business mechanics. I had to manually bypass his authorization to reroute those funds because he was stubbornly sitting on dead capital while Julian needed liquidity for expansion. I am protecting this family from an old man's decaying brain." He had just confessed, on a crystal-clear digital recording, to financial manipulation, unauthorized transfer of funds, and elder financial abuse. "I will read the papers tonight," I whispered, looking down at the floor. "Just get it done by tomorrow," he snapped, turning on his heel and walking out the door. The moment his taillights disappeared down the road, I went straight down to the basement command center. It was time to go on the offensive. I logged into my secured terminal and accessed my alpha-level clearance from the Vanguard Echo Directorate. I could not arrest Julian yet, but I could absolutely bleed him dry. I cross-referenced the data packets and identified the 12 offshore shell companies that were funneling the foreign intelligence money into Julian's corporate accounts. I bypassed the standard international banking protocols. With a few precise keystrokes, I injected a classified anti-terrorism financial block into the global banking system. specifically targeting those 12 routing numbers. I froze the international cash flows completely. The money was trapped in a digital void. Julian would open his financial ledgers tomorrow morning and find absolutely nothing. His foreign lifelines were severed, and because the block was implemented through ghost protocols, he would have absolutely zero idea why his investors had suddenly stopped paying him. The siege had officially begun. The fourth Thursday of November arrived, bringing with it a biting chill that stripped the last leaves from the Maryland oak trees. Inside my grandfather's massive, custom-built glass greenhouse. However, the air was warm, heavy, and fragrant with the scent of blooming orchids and damp earth. Arthur had orchestrated this Thanksgiving gathering with absolute precision. He had sent out formal, embossed invitations not just to the extended Lane family, but also to the 7 largest private shareholders of Julian's tech company. The official pretext of the meeting was a solemn, private ceremony to formally discuss the handover of the family legacy and intellectual properties. The shareholders arrived first, sipping warm, spiced cider, their eyes darting around with greedy anticipation. They believed they were about to witness the final coronation of their golden CEO. Then, my father arrived, wearing a smug expression, clearly convinced that his underhanded legal maneuverings were about to pay off. Finally, Julian made his grand entrance. He did not walk. He strutted. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people earned in an entire year. Flanking him like loyal attack dogs were 3 high-priced corporate attorneys carrying sleek leather briefcases. Julian looked like a conqueror stepping onto a defeated battlefield. He was blissfully unaware that the sudden freezing of his international accounts over the past week was my doing. He likely thought it was a temporary banking error that would be solved the moment he seized total control of the core algorithms today. My grandfather sat quietly at the head of the long oak table we had brought into the center of the greenhouse, his hands resting on his polished wooden cane. I stood silently in the corner, blending into the background of tropical foliage, watching the prey walk willingly into the cage. Julian confidently took the seat directly across from Arthur. He did not offer a warm Thanksgiving greeting or ask how his grandfather was doing. Instead, he snapped his fingers, and his lead attorney immediately slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood. "Grandpa," Julian began, using a patronizing, sickeningly sweet tone that made my skin crawl. "We all know your health has been declining rapidly over the last 6 months. The mind is simply not what it used to be. It is perfectly natural at your advanced age. I have brought these transfer agreements to make things completely easy for you. Just sign over the intellectual property rights to me, completely and permanently. Let me carry the heavy burden of the company so you can finally rest." My father chimed in from the sidelines, nodding eagerly like an obedient servant. "It is the right thing to do. Arthur, we are only thinking of your well-being. It is time to let the younger generation take the wheel." The greenhouse was completely silent, save for the gentle hum of the climate control system. My grandfather did not look at the papers. He did not even blink. From the deep shadows of the tall ferns behind Arthur, a figure stepped forward. It was Evelyn Hayes. She was dressed in a sharp navy blazer, holding a thick manila folder with both hands. Julian frowned, clearly confused and irritated by the presence of a stranger invading his moment of triumph. "Who is this?" Julian demanded, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "This is a private family matter. Security should not have let you in." Evelyn ignored him completely. She walked right up to the table and slammed her folder down with a violent crack that made several of the wealthy shareholders jump out of their seats. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," she announced, her voice ringing out with the terrifying authority of a military tribunal judge. "I am General Lane's primary legal counsel, and I am here to inform you that the sealed petition you and your father secretly filed in county court last week, attempting to declare my client legally incompetent, has been summarily dismissed with extreme prejudice." Julian's face went completely rigid. My father literally choked on his spiced cider, coughing violently into his linen napkin. Evelyn opened the folder. Pulling out several crisp, white documents, bearing the official gold seals of highly respected medical institutions. I hold in my hands independent, comprehensive neurological evaluations from 3 of the top medical specialists in the United States, Evelyn continued, her words hitting the room like artillery shells. Conducted less than 48 hours ago, they unanimously conclude that General Arthur Lane possesses a cognitive function, memory retention, and analytical capability that is sharper than most men 30 years his junior. He has absolutely no trace of dementia. Your fraudulent medical claims are not only legally void, but they also constitute immediate grounds for a massive countersuit for defamation and attempted fraud. The shareholders began muttering nervously among themselves, throwing suspicious glances at Julian. Julian swallowed hard, a prominent bead of sweat forming on his temple and rolling down his cheek, but his massive ego refused to let him retreat or admit defeat. "Fine," Julian spat, dropping the fake concern entirely and glaring at his grandfather with pure malice. "So you passed a basic memory test. Congratulations. That does not change the business reality one bit. The company needs the intellectual property secured under my name right now to satisfy the board of directors and our institutional investors. You gave me the technology to start the business. It is rightfully mine. Sign the papers. Arthur, or I will tie you up in endless civil litigation until the day you die." My grandfather finally moved. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a single, heavily yellowed envelope. He handled it with immense care, sliding it across the table until it rested right next to Julian's aggressive legal stack. "I never gave you anything, Julian," my grandfather said, his voice cold, steady, and devoid of any familial warmth. "I allowed you to borrow it." Evelyn extracted a fragile, perfectly preserved document from the old envelope. "What you are looking at," she explained to the panicked lawyers and the breathless shareholders, "are the original patent filings from 1994, completely securing 100% ownership of the core artificial intelligence algorithms under General Arthur Lane. Furthermore, we have the original licensing agreement signed by Julian exactly 7 years ago." Julian's lead attorney snatched the paper from the table, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. "Read Section 4, Paragraph 2 aloud," Evelyn commanded, pointing a sharp, perfectly manicured finger at the lawyer. The attorney's hands began to shake visibly, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen shade of gray. He looked up at Julian, absolute terror reflecting in his eyes. "Julian," the lawyer whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. "It is a conditional, revocable lease. It strictly prohibits any unauthorized sublicensing, especially to foreign entities, and it forbids any unauthorized modification of the core military code. If breached, the licensor maintains the unilateral right to instantly revoke all usage privileges without any prior notice or financial compensation." Julian grabbed the paper, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning, catastrophic horror. "What does that mean? Stop speaking in legal riddles." "It means," my grandfather boomed, his voice suddenly carrying the full, terrifying weight of a commanding general directing a war zone, "that you breached the contract the moment you started selling backdoor access to foreign shell companies. I am revoking the license, right here, right now. You do not own the algorithms. You do not own the software. You own absolutely nothing." The greenhouse erupted into absolute chaos. The shareholders began shouting at the top of their lungs, realizing instantly that the $2 billion company they had heavily invested in was suddenly reduced to a completely worthless, empty shell. Without the core military algorithms to run the artificial intelligence, Julian's grand empire was nothing more than expensive rented office space and useless plastic servers. Julian's attorneys were already frantically packing their briefcases, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from a client who was legally and financially dead in the water. My father slumped heavily into a wicker chair, holding his face in his hands, realizing his own financial complicity in the money laundering was about to be exposed to the public. Julian completely lost his mind. The polished, arrogant billionaire persona shattered into a million pathetic pieces on the greenhouse floor, His face turned a dark, furious shade of red, and thick veins popped in his neck as he scrambled desperately to find a target for his overwhelming rage. He bypassed Evelyn. He bypassed our grandfather. He locked his crazed, furious eyes directly onto me, standing quietly in the corner of the room. "You!" Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my face. He lunged forward, knocking over a heavy wooden chair in the process. "This is your doing. You put him up to this, you pathetic, jealous little nobody. You could never build a single thing in your miserable, paper-pushing life, so you manipulated a crazy old man to destroy my greatness out of pure spite. You are nothing. Do you hear me? You are nothing." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back to defend myself. I just looked at his pathetic red face, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical pity, knowing that my turn to speak had finally, beautifully arrived. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the towering tropical ferns, my posture shifting completely. I was no longer the quiet, submissive girl who sat with her head bowed at the Christmas dinner table, absorbing the endless mockery of my relatives. I walked deliberately toward the center of the room, my footsteps clicking sharply against the stone floor, the sound perfectly matching the sudden, erratic beating of my brother's panicked heart. Julian was still panting heavily, his chest heaving with misplaced rage after screaming at me. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. True power never has to shout. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored wool jacket and pulled out a solid black leather wallet. With a swift, practiced flick of my wrist, I flipped it open and held it up high for the entire room to see. Pinned tightly to the leather was the heavy, matte black and silver shield of the Vanguard Echo Directorate, a classified federal crest that struck absolute terror into the hearts of international syndicates. Next, I reached into the tactical satchel slung across my shoulder and pulled out a massive, tightly bound dossier. I tossed it onto the polished oak table with a violent flick of my wrist. It landed with a heavy, deafening thud right on top of his completely useless legal documents, sliding just enough to knock over a crystal glass of cider. "You have always been incredibly loud, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the humid, suffocating air of the greenhouse like a newly sharpened blade. "But you have never been smart. You called me a paper pusher. You called me a miserable nobody, but you failed to ask what kind of papers I was actually pushing." Julian stared blankly at the black badge, his eyes darting frantically between the silver crest and my face. His brain completely failed to process the reality unfolding in front of him. The wealthy shareholders collectively held their breath, their eyes wide with dawning horror. "I am not a desk clerk," I stated clearly, letting the absolute truth wash over the terrified room. "I am a senior special agent for the United States government, specializing in counterintelligence and catastrophic cyber threats, and for the past 8 months, my primary target for a massive multi-agency federal investigation has been you." I gestured toward the thick file resting on the table. "Inside that folder is the complete, unredacted history of your treason. We have every single encrypted email you sent to foreign operatives. We have the digital blueprints of the backdoor access you intentionally coded into the military algorithms. We have the exact timestamps of every dollar you received from hostile state intelligence agencies to keep your fraudulent, sinking ship afloat." My father let out a strange, strangled gasp from the sidelines. He took 2 stumbling steps backward, his knees buckling beneath him as if invisible weights had just been dropped onto his shoulders. He collapsed heavily onto the cold stone floor, his hands desperately clutching his chest. In that singular, horrifying moment, the blinding veil of his arrogance was violently ripped away. He finally realized that in his desperate attempt to protect Julian's fake empire and hide the financial bleeding, he had not just committed corporate fraud. By washing that specific money through our family real estate trusts, his greed had made him a direct accomplice to high treason against the United States of America. "You," Julian stammered, his voice cracking horribly. His arrogant billionaire facade had completely dissolved into raw, pathetic terror. No, this is a joke. This is insane." "It is over, Julian," I replied, my expression carved from solid stone. As if summoned directly by my words, the distant, piercing wail of heavy sirens suddenly tore through the quiet afternoon air. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing deafeningly loud as a massive convoy of unmarked, armored black sport utility vehicles tore up the long gravel driveway. The tranquil, serene atmosphere of the greenhouse was violently shattered. Brilliant, blinding flashes of red and blue tactical lights pierced through the glass panes, casting chaotic, frantic shadows across the terrified faces of the shareholders and the paralyzed attorneys. Heavy boots slammed aggressively against the wooden deck outside. The main doors of the greenhouse were violently thrown open, the thick glass rattling fiercely in its frame. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests, and carrying automatic rifles flooded into the room. They moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency, quickly forming a solid, impenetrable perimeter around the oak table. "Federal agents! Nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them," the lead tactical commander roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Two heavily armed agents instantly flanked Julian. They grabbed his arms, twisting them forcefully behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed in the silent, stunned room. Julian was physically shoved against the edge of the table, his legs trembling so violently he could barely support his own weight. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. He twisted his neck painfully, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes filled with rapid, spilling tears. The titan of industry was entirely gone, replaced by a frightened, pathetic criminal begging for his life. "Maria, please," Julian choked out, sobbing openly as the agents began to drag him forcefully toward the exit. "Please, tell them to stop. I am your brother. We are family. You have to help me." I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of the man who had tormented me and betrayed his country. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no hesitation. "The law," I said coldly, my voice ringing with absolute finality, "does not care about our family name." Several months after that fateful Thanksgiving afternoon, the dust finally settled over the absolute ruins of my brother's empire. The company that was once valued at over $2 billion had completely dissolved into nothing but a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Julian was indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, corporate espionage, and high treason. He was currently sitting in a maximum security facility, awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly end with a sentence of at least 30 years in federal prison. My father did not fare much better. The government seized all of his assets to pay off the massive fines incurred from the money laundering operation. He was left completely bankrupt and was placed under indefinite house arrest. The only person who managed to avoid the legal fallout was my mother. Though she was entirely broken by the social humiliation, she called me exactly one time. I answered the phone to the sound of her frantic sobbing. "Maria, please," she cried, her voice trembling with a desperate, pathetic edge. "You have to help them. You have connections now. Please, have mercy on your own blood." I sat by the window, watching the rain fall, feeling absolutely no emotional pull toward the woman on the other end of the line. "Blood simply means we share genetics," I replied, my voice calm and completely unyielding. "It does not give you the right to exploit, betray, and trample over others. You chose your legacy. Now you must live with it. Do not ever call this number again." I hung up the phone and permanently severed the final tie to that toxic bloodline. In the weeks that followed, my grandfather and I worked closely with Evelyn Hayes to restructure the remains of his intellectual property. Arthur officially transferred 100% of his assets, patents, and wealth directly into my name. But neither of us had any interest in becoming corporate billionaires. Instead, we converted the entire technological trust into a specialized, non-profit cybersecurity foundation dedicated to providing advanced threat analysis for government intelligence agencies. The technology was finally back where it belonged, protecting the people instead of exploiting them. The following autumn was my grandfather's last. His health began to fade quietly, not from a decaying mind, but simply from a body that had fought too many wars and lived a long, full life. On a crisp, golden afternoon in late October, I pushed his wheelchair out onto the back patio of the Maryland estate. The air was cool, and the trees were burning with vibrant shades of red and orange. He sat in silence for a long time, watching the leaves fall gently onto the manicured grass. Then, he slowly reached out his frail, trembling hand and placed it over mine. His grip was weak, but his eyes were just as sharp and clear as the day he had walked into that dining room in Aspen. "You did well, Maria," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the autumn breeze. "You are the only true pride of the Lane family." Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 days later. His death left a massive, aching void in my heart. He was the only real family I had ever known, but mixed with the profound grief was a strange, beautiful sense of absolute freedom. The oppressive, suffocating shadow of the Lane family expectations was gone forever. I was finally free. A week after the funeral, I walked through the heavily reinforced steel doors of the Vanguard Echo Directorate. The hallway was dimly lit, echoing with the quiet hum of massive server racks and the focused energy of intelligence operatives working to keep the nation safe. I swiped my black badge, stepping into the top secret briefing room. As I looked around the table at my team, preparing to dismantle a new global threat, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace. I finally understood the truth. I would much rather be a complete nobody, standing silently in the dark to protect the world, than a fake, hollow somebody burning brightly under the blinding neon lights of absolute vanity. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would absolutely love to know. If you found today's story engaging and worthwhile, please consider helping our channel with a donation of just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support is the only way we can pay our hardworking staff, help them feed their families, and continue creating these wonderful stories for you. Thank you again, and have a beautiful day.